December 1943. Republic Aviation's sprawling factory complex in Farmingdale, Long Island, stretched across acres of concrete and steel under a gray winter sky. The smell of machine oil, hot metal, and aircraft fuel filled the cold air as thousands of workers moved between hangars where P-47 Thunderbolt fighters awaited final assembly. Inside Hangar 7, amid the deafening roar of riveting guns and the sharp whine of hydraulic presses, 22-year-old Eleanor Breslin crouched beneath the wing of a half-assembled fighter, her calloused hands tracing the aileron control cables with practiced precision. Her dark hair was tied back in a faded red bandana, her coveralls stained with grease and hydraulic fluid. Around her, the organized chaos of wartime production continued without pause. The war in Europe demanded more planes, faster planes, better planes. Every Thunderbolt that rolled off the assembly line meant another American pilot had a chance to come home. Eleanor understood this better than most. Her older brother Michael had been flying P-47s with the 56th Fighter Group somewhere over Germany for 8 months. His letters, when they came, were heavily censored, but always ended the same way. "These birds are tough, Ellie. Just make sure the new ones are built right." She thought of those words every time her hands touched cold metal. Before we continue with Eleanor's story, if you're enjoying this journey into the extraordinary contributions of wartime aviation mechanics, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us bring more untold stories from history to light. Eleanor had grown up in Queens, the daughter of a machinist who'd worked at the Brooklyn Navy Yard before the Depression forced him to take whatever jobs he could find. He'd taught her to read blueprints before she learned to read books, showed her how to feel the tolerance of a bolt's threading, how to listen to an engine and hear what it needed. When the war started and factories began hiring women by the thousands, Eleanor was one of the first through Republic Aviation's gates. That was 18 months ago. Since then, she'd proven herself indispensable, earning the respect of veteran mechanics who initially doubted whether any woman belonged on a factory floor. But respect didn't mean they listened to her ideas. For weeks, Eleanor had been studying pilot combat reports that circulated through the engineering department. The documents made for grim reading. P-47 pilots praised their aircraft's ruggedness, its devastating firepower, its ability to absorb punishment and bring them home. But they also reported a consistent problem. In dogfights with German Focke-Wulf 190s and Messerschmitt 109s, the Thunderbolt's roll rate was too slow. The enemy fighters could reverse direction faster, could outmaneuver the heavier American plane in turning combat. Pilots were dying because of seconds, because of the time it took their ailerons to respond to control inputs. Eleanor had noticed something during assembly. The aileron control cables ran through a series of pulleys from the cockpit stick to the wing surfaces. Standard installation used rigid pulley brackets that maintained cable tension through spring-loaded tensioners. It worked, but the system had friction points, tiny resistances that added up to sluggish response. She'd calculated that by replacing 3 specific pulley assemblies with a modified wire loop system, using aircraft-grade steel cable formed into precisely angled loops, she could reduce friction by nearly 40% and decrease control input lag by almost 3 seconds. 3 seconds. In aerial combat, that was an eternity. She'd presented her idea to her shift supervisor, Frank Kowalski, a gray-haired former mechanic who'd been building aircraft since the Great War. He'd listened, nodded, and told her the engineering department would review it. That was 3 weeks ago. Yesterday, she'd seen the same pilot reports still circulating, still describing the same problems. Men were still dying, while her solution gathered dust on someone's desk. The winter light was fading when Eleanor made her decision. Hangar 7 contained 2 P-47s designated for final quality inspection before delivery. One of them, tail number 2026854, was scheduled for its control surface check the following morning. The inspection team wouldn't arrive until 7 o'clock. Eleanor's shift ended at midnight. That gave her 7 hours. She waited until the factory quieted, until most workers had streamed toward the parking lots and bus stops. The skeleton crew on night maintenance worked in other hangars. Eleanor gathered her tools, wire cutters, tension gauges, calibrated wrenches, the components she'd been fabricating secretly over the past week. Her heart hammered as she approached 2026854, but her hands remained steady. This wasn't about breaking rules. This was about saving lives. The aileron control system on a P-47 Thunderbolt was remarkably straightforward in principle, but complex in execution. The pilot's control stick connected through a series of cables and pulleys to the aileron surfaces on each wing. Push the stick left, the left aileron rose while the right aileron dropped, banking the aircraft. The system needed to be responsive yet precise, strong enough to withstand the forces of high-speed flight, yet sensitive enough to give the pilot fine control. Eleanor's modification targeted the 3 pulley assemblies where friction was highest. Working by flashlight in the cold hangar, she carefully removed the standard rigid brackets and installed her wire loop assemblies. Each loop was formed from braided steel cable, bent and secured at precise angles she'd calculated using the factory's engineering references. The loops maintained cable tension while allowing the control cables to move through them with minimal resistance. She'd borrowed the principle from bicycle brake cables, adapting it for the extreme forces of fighter aircraft control systems. The work was meticulous, demanding absolute precision. A single miscalculation could cause control failure at altitude, could kill a pilot as surely as enemy fire. Eleanor checked and rechecked every measurement, tested every connection, verified tension with her gauges. The factory's steam heat had been turned down for the night, and her breath formed clouds in the cold air as she worked. Her fingers grew numb, but she didn't dare work with gloves. This required touch, feel, the ability to sense if something wasn't exactly right. By 4 a.m, the installation was complete. Eleanor ran the control cables through their full range of motion, feeling for any binding or unusual resistance. The response was immediate, smooth, exactly as her calculations had predicted. She tested the system 20 times, then 20 more, documenting every measurement in her personal notebook. The numbers confirmed what her hands already knew. This worked. The problem now was what to do about it. She'd modified a military aircraft without authorization. The official penalties for that could range from immediate firing to possible prosecution for sabotage. But if she simply waited for the inspection team to discover the modification, she'd lose any chance to explain her reasoning, to show them the data supporting her design. Eleanor sat in the cockpit of 226854 as dawn light began filtering through the hangar's high windows, weighing her options. She decided on honesty. At 6:30, she found the telephone in the shift supervisor's office and called Frank Kowalski at home. His wife answered, irritated at the early hour, then put him on the line. "This better be good, Breslin." "Frank, I modified the aileron controls on 226854. I need you to come look at it before the inspection team arrives." The silence on the line stretched so long she thought he'd hung up. Then, "You did what?" "Well, I installed a wire loop system to reduce control friction. The calculations show a 40% improvement in response time. Frank, this could save pilots' lives." Another long silence. "Don't touch anything else. I'll be there in 20 minutes. And Breslin, you better hope you're right about this." Frank arrived with Chief Engineer Thomas Brennan, a severe man in his 50s, who looked at Eleanor like she'd lost her mind. They examined the modification in hostile silence while Eleanor stood by, her notebook ready, her arguments prepared. Frank tested the control stick movement, frowning. Brennan crawled under the wing, inspecting every connection, his face revealing nothing. Finally, Brennan emerged and demanded to see her calculations. Eleanor handed him her notebook, watching as he studied the pages covered in her careful handwriting, her diagrams and stress calculations. The equations were sound. She'd triple-checked every number, every assumption. Brennan's expression shifted from anger to something else, something she couldn't quite read. "These loop assemblies," he said slowly, "where did you fabricate them?" "Tool crib on B shift. I used scrap materials from rejected cable assemblies. I didn't steal anything." "That's not what I'm asking. I'm asking how you learned to calculate tensile loads and friction coefficients at this level. This is engineering mathematics." Eleanor met his eyes. "My father taught me, and I've been reading the engineering manuals in the factory library for 18 months. Brennan looked at Frank, then back at Eleanor. "The inspection team will be here in 30 minutes. We need to decide what to do about this." "The modification works," Eleanor said. "Test it. If I'm wrong, fire me, but if I'm right, every P-47 we build should have this system." What happened next surprised everyone. Brennan didn't fire her. Instead, he delayed the inspection, claiming a scheduling conflict, and called in the factory's chief test pilot, a former Navy aviator named Jack Morrison, who'd been testing Republic aircraft for 2 years. Morrison listened to Eleanor's explanation with skeptical interest, examined the modification, then climbed into 226854's cockpit. For 10 minutes, Morrison worked the control stick through its full range of motion, testing response, feeling for any abnormality. The hangar had filled with day shift workers, and word had spread about the unauthorized modification. Dozens of people watched as the test pilot finally climbed down from the cockpit. "The response is noticeably quicker," Morrison said. "Noticeably, but I can't properly evaluate this on the ground. We need flight testing." Brennan shook his head. "We can't flight test an unauthorized modification to a military aircraft. The regulations are clear." "Then let me be clear," Morrison replied. "If this system does what Miss Breslin claims, it could change the tactical equation for every P-47 pilot in combat. We have an obligation to test it properly." The argument continued for another hour, involving phone calls to Republic Aviation's senior management and eventually to Army Air Force's technical representatives at Wright Field in Ohio. Eleanor stood to the side, watching her idea being debated by men whose authority far exceeded hers. She'd done everything she could, the rest was out of her hands. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Major Richard Sullivan, an Army Air Force's liaison officer who'd been quietly observing the discussion, stepped forward with a proposal. Sullivan had flown P-47s in combat over North Africa before being rotated stateside to work on technical development. He understood both the tactical reality and the bureaucratic requirements. "And I can authorize a limited test flight under my authority," Sullivan said. "One aircraft, one flight, controlled conditions. If the system shows promise, we fast-track it through proper channels. If it doesn't, we remove it and document the attempt. Either way, we get an answer." 2 days later, Morrison took 222-6854 up for its test flight from Republic's auxiliary airfield. Eleanor wasn't allowed on the flight line. Regulations prohibited that, but Frank brought her to the engineering office where they could watch through binoculars. The Thunderbolt climbed into a clear winter sky, its massive Pratt and Whitney radial engine thundering across Long Island. For 45 minutes, Morrison put the aircraft through a series of aerobatic maneuvers, rolls, loops, high-speed turns, the kind of violent maneuvering that would occur in combat. When he landed, Morrison's first words were directed at Eleanor. "You just gave every P-47 pilot 3 seconds they didn't have before. 3 seconds to live, to react, to fight. How soon can we install this on every Thunderbolt in production?" The answer to Morrison's question involved navigating the complex bureaucracy of wartime military procurement. Eleanor's wire loop system had to be formally documented, tested against military specifications, approved by engineering review boards, and integrated into Republic Aviation's production standards. The process normally took months. Major Sullivan used his connections to compress it into 3 weeks. During those weeks, Eleanor found herself pulled from the assembly line into the engineering department. Her practical knowledge of aircraft systems, combined with her intuitive understanding of mechanical principles, made her invaluable in refining the modification for mass production. She worked alongside degree engineers who initially resented her presence but gradually recognized her competence. The wire loop system was officially designated Modification Package 47A, though workers on the factory floor called it the Breslin Loop. By March 1944, every P-47 Thunderbolt leaving Republic Aviation's factory incorporated Eleanor's modification. Retrofit kits were shipped to operational squadrons in England, North Africa, and the Pacific. The reports that came back were unanimous. The improved roll rate was immediately noticeable, giving American pilots a crucial advantage in turning combat with German fighters. The P-47's reputation as a rugged but sluggish fighter began to change. Pilots started winning dogfights they would have lost. Eleanor never met any of those pilots. She remained in Farmingdale, working long shifts in the engineering department, contributing to dozens of other small improvements that collectively made the Thunderbolt more effective. She received a commendation letter from the Army Air Forces, a small bonus from Republic Aviation, and a mention in the company newsletter. Her photograph appeared in a Long Island newspaper article about women's contributions to the war effort, though the article got her age wrong and misspelled her last name. What mattered more to Eleanor arrived in May 1944, a letter from Michael. The censors had allowed him to write that his squadron had received the new modification, that the difference was incredible, that for the first time his P-47 could match a Focke-Wulf in a rolling scissors maneuver. "I don't know who figured this out," he wrote, "but they saved my life yesterday." Eleanor kept that letter in her toolbox, read it whenever her hands were tired and the work seemed endless. The war continued. Eleanor continued. She worked 60-hour weeks, slept in a cramped apartment she shared with 3 other factory women, survived on rationed coffee and determination. The apartment on Steinway Street in Astoria had thin walls and unreliable heat. Her roommates were Mary, who worked the riveting line, Patricia, who assembled hydraulic systems, and Susan, who painted identification numbers on fuselages. They took turns cooking on a hot plate, shared cigarettes on the fire escape during air raid drills, and fell asleep to the distant sound of assembly line shifts changing at midnight. The work was exhausting, demanding, occasionally dangerous. Eleanor saw friends lose fingers to machinery, saw the strain of wartime production wear down even the strongest workers. In April 1944, a woman named Dorothy Harrison got her hair caught in a lathe on the night shift. By the time someone hit the emergency stop, she'd lost part of her scalp. The factory paid her medical bills and gave her a desk job in inventory, but Dorothy was never the same. Eleanor started wearing her bandana tied twice as tight after that, checking it compulsively throughout each shift. The factory floor operated under constant pressure to increase production. Management posted daily quotas on bulletin boards, tracking each department's output against impossible targets. Republic Aviation competed with other manufacturers for Army contracts, and every airplane delivered ahead of schedule meant more funding, more orders, more job security. The workers understood this calculus even if they resented it. They pushed themselves beyond exhaustion because somewhere over Germany or the Pacific, American boys were fighting in planes they'd built, and every hour of delay could mean another pilot flying an obsolete aircraft against an enemy who never stopped improving their own technology. Eleanor's promotion to junior engineer changed her relationship with the assembly line workers. Some resented her advancement, saw it as favoritism or tokenism. A few men who'd been passed over for promotion made their displeasure known through cold shoulders and deliberate non-cooperation. But most workers, especially the women, saw Eleanor as proof that competence could overcome prejudice. She became someone they brought problems to, someone who listened when a riveter noticed a design flaw or a painter spotted a quality control issue that inspectors had missed. One of those workers was Rita Kowalski, Frank's daughter, who'd joined the factory in early 1944 after finishing high school. Rita worked in the electrical systems department, installing the complex wiring that connected radios, instruments, and weapon systems. She was quick, meticulous, and curious, constantly asking Eleanor questions about circuit design and power distribution. Eleanor recognized in Rita the same hunger for knowledge that had driven her own education, the desire to understand not just how to do a job, but why it worked the way it did. They started meeting for lunch in the cafeteria, where Eleanor would sketch diagrams on napkins, explaining electrical theory and mechanical principles. Rita absorbed everything, filled notebooks with calculations and observations. Frank noticed his daughter's interest and, with surprising progressive thinking for a man of his generation, encouraged it. He'd seen what Eleanor had accomplished, understood that the future would need engineers regardless of their gender, and wanted his daughter to have opportunities he'd never imagined possible. But she also saw what they were building, saw the steady stream of fighters rolling out to defend freedom, and understood that every rivet she set, every system she checked, every improvement she contributed was part of something larger than herself. The impact of the Breslin Loop became clearer as combat reports filtered back from Europe through the summer and fall of 1944. The 56th Fighter Group, Michael's squadron, reported a dramatic increase in successful engagements against German fighters. Pilots who'd previously avoided turning fights with Focke-Wulf 190s now actively sought them out, confident in their aircraft's improved maneuverability. The Thunderbolt's reputation evolved from a rugged but limited fighter bomber into a formidable air superiority platform. Major Sullivan visited the factory in June with a fighter pilot named Captain James Morrison, no relation to test pilot Jack Morrison. Captain Morrison had flown 63 combat missions over France and Germany, had 11 confirmed kills, and had been shot down once over the Channel. He walked with a slight limp from that bailout, and his eyes carried the 1,000-yard stare that marked men who'd seen too much combat too young. Sullivan brought him to the engineering department specifically to meet Eleanor. The captain stood in his dress uniform, looking uncomfortable among the drafting tables and calculation sheets, while Eleanor felt equally uncomfortable being pulled from her work for what she assumed was a publicity event. But when Sullivan explained that Morrison wanted to thank the person who designed the control modification, the captain's discomfort made sudden sense. "Ma'am," Morrison said, his voice rough from cigarettes and high-altitude oxygen, "I don't know how to say this properly, so I'll just say it plain. 3 weeks ago, over Stuttgart, I got into a turning fight with two 190s. Got one on the first pass, but the second one was good, real good. He tried to reverse on me, and I reversed inside him. Shouldn't have been possible in a 47, but with your modification, I stayed inside his turn. Got him clean. Without that extra response time, I'd be dead or in a POW camp right now." Eleanor didn't know how to respond. She'd spent months thinking about her modification in abstract terms, friction coefficients and response curves and tactical advantages. Facing a man who'd lived because of her work made it suddenly overwhelmingly real. "I just did the math," she finally said. "The pilots are the ones doing the hard part." Morrison shook his head. "Ma'am, with respect, we do what we're trained to do, but you gave us a tool that changes the odds. That's something else entirely." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a small object wrapped in a handkerchief. "This is against regulations, but I wanted you to have it anyway." The object was a piece of aluminum, roughly cut and engraved with careful but unpracticed letters, "Breslin Loop, Stuttgart 6 Dachshund 1544, J.M." It was a fragment of the Focke-Wulf Morrison had shot down, a piece of his kill marked with the modification that had made it possible. Eleanor kept that piece of aluminum on her desk for the rest of the war, and later in her office at Breslin Precision Manufacturing. It reminded her that engineering wasn't just mathematics and metal. It was about people, about the young men who trusted their lives to machines built by hands they'd never shake, designed by minds they'd never meet. The responsibility of that trust was something she carried for the rest of her life. The stream of combat reports continued through the summer of 1944 as Allied forces pushed across France after D-Day. P-47 Thunderbolts flew thousands of sorties, providing close air support for ground troops and engaging German fighters that attempted to interfere. The improved roll rate from Eleanor's modification proved particularly valuable in low-altitude combat, where pilots had less room to maneuver and needed every advantage they could get. Fighter groups reported fewer losses in air-to-air combat, more successful intercepts of enemy aircraft, higher pilot confidence in their equipment. Republic Aviation's management, never shy about promoting their achievements, began including the Breslin Loop in their technical literature and advertisements. Eleanor found her innovation mentioned in Aviation Week magazine, in Army Air Force's training bulletins, and engineering journals that discussed wartime technical developments. Her name appeared in some articles, was omitted from others, was occasionally misspelled or attributed incorrectly. She learned not to care about recognition, to focus instead on the work itself. That work expanded beyond the P-47. Republic was developing the P-84 Thunderjet, their first jet-powered fighter, and Eleanor found herself involved in control system design from the beginning. Jet aircraft operated at speeds that made conventional control responses inadequate. The principles she'd applied to the Breslin Loop, reducing friction and improving responsiveness, became even more critical at 600 miles per hour. She worked with a team of engineers to design entirely new control systems, incorporating hydraulic assistance and innovative cable routing that would become standard in post-war jet fighters. The technical challenges were immense and fascinating. Jet aircraft generated different aerodynamic forces, required different pilot inputs, operated in flight regimes where traditional design assumptions no longer applied. Eleanor threw herself into the problems with the same intensity she'd brought to the P-47 modification, spending long hours in wind tunnels and test facilities, working through calculations that predicted how controls would behave at speeds no pilot had yet experienced. The work was classified, restricted to engineers with security clearances, and represented the future of military aviation. In September 1944, Frank Kowalski suffered a heart attack on the factory floor and was hospitalized for 2 weeks. His doctors told him to retire, to stop working 60-hour weeks at age 58, to let younger men carry the burden. Frank ignored them and came back to work in October, but Eleanor noticed he moved slower, tired more easily, couldn't climb ladders without stopping to catch his breath. She quietly took on some of his supervisory duties, coordinating with shift managers and handling technical disputes that would have normally gone to him. Rita worried about her father constantly, bringing him lunch from home and making sure he took the medication his doctors prescribed. Eleanor watched their relationship with a mixture of admiration and envy. Her own father had died in 1941, just before the war started, just before he could see his daughter become the engineer he'd always believed she could be. She wondered what he would have thought of the Breslin Loop, of her promotion, of the fact that his lessons about reading metal and understanding machinery had saved lives halfway around the world. In August 1944, Republic Aviation promoted Eleanor to junior engineer, making her one of the first women to hold that title in American aviation manufacturing. The promotion came with better pay, more responsibility, and the opportunity to work on new aircraft designs already being developed for the post-war era. Some of the male engineers grumbled about her rapid advancement, suggesting it was wartime affirmative action rather than merit. Thomas Brennan, who'd become her mentor, shut down those complaints by pointing to her contribution record. 17 documented improvements to P-47 production, 3 innovations incorporated into the upcoming P-84 jet fighter design, and the Breslin Loop that had changed air combat tactics. Michael came home in October 1944, his tour completed, his squadron having achieved one of the highest victory-to-loss ratios in the European theater. He visited Eleanor at the factory, wearing his leather flight jacket with its squadron patch, looking older than his 25 years. They stood together in a Hangar 7, watching new Thunderbolts move down the assembly line. "Every time I rolled into a German fighter," Michael said quietly, "every time my bird responded faster than his, I thought about you, about all of you here, building them right, making them better." He looked at his sister, this young woman who'd spent her war in coveralls rather than uniform, whose contribution would never earn medals or headlines. "You saved more pilots than I ever could, Ellie." She didn't know what to say to that. The work had been its own reward, the knowledge that her hands had shaped metal into protection for American pilots. But hearing her brother say those words, standing in the hangar where she'd taken that calculated risk on a cold December night, Eleanor felt something shift inside her. Pride, maybe. Or simply the quiet satisfaction of having done what needed doing, regardless of the rules that said she shouldn't. The war in Europe ended in May 1945. Japan surrendered in August. The massive machinery of wartime production began winding down, and the factory that had employed thousands started laying off workers by the hundreds. Eleanor knew her position was secure, her skills were too valuable, but she watched friends and colleagues receive their termination notices with growing unease. These women had proven themselves as capable as any man, had learned complex trades and performed them excellently, yet peacetime America seemed determined to push them back into traditional roles. Republic Aviation offered her a permanent position in their engineering department, working on the new generation of jet fighters that would define post-war military aviation. The salary was good, the work would be challenging, and she'd be one of the few women engineers in the industry. Eleanor considered the offer seriously. But she also remembered her father's machine shop, closed during the Depression, and thought about what she could build on her own terms. In November 1945, using her war savings and a small business loan, Eleanor opened Breslin Precision Manufacturing in a converted warehouse in Queens. The shop specialized in high-tolerance mechanical components for aviation and industrial applications. She employed 12 workers initially, mostly women who'd been laid off from war factories, teaching them the precision machining skills that would keep them employed in peacetime. The business struggled at first, competing for contracts in an industry dominated by established firms, but Eleanor's reputation and the quality of her work gradually built a steady client base. Years later, when aviation historians studied the technical evolution of World War II fighters, most focused on engines, armaments, and aerodynamics. Few noticed the small modifications made by factory workers, the incremental improvements that collectively made aircraft more survivable. The Breslin loop merited perhaps a footnote in technical manuals, usually attributed to Republic aviation engineering staff, without naming individual contributors. Eleanor never minded the anonymity. She knew what she'd contributed, knew the pilots who'd lived because their controls responded 3 seconds faster. That knowledge was enough. She built her business, trained new generations of precision machinists, and occasionally gave talks at engineering schools about the importance of practical experience combined with theoretical knowledge. She never presented herself as remarkable, never claimed to be anything more than a mechanic who'd learned to think like an engineer. On December mornings when the air turned cold and carried the smell of machine oil, Eleanor sometimes thought back to that night in Hangar 7, crouched under a P-47's wing with her flashlight and her calculations, making a choice that could have ended her career. She'd been terrified and certain in equal measure, driven by the conviction that a good idea shouldn't die in bureaucracy while pilots died in combat. That conviction had defined not just that night, but her entire approach to life and work. The wire loop modification she'd invented in 1943 remained standard on P-47 Thunderbolts through the end of the war and influenced control system designs in subsequent aircraft. Over 15,000 Thunderbolts were built with her improvement, and each one carried into combat the ingenuity of a 22-year-old mechanic who understood that sometimes the difference between life and death is measured in seconds, and that those seconds are worth fighting for, even when the fight means breaking rules made by people who've never had to trust their lives to the machines. They build. Eleanor Breslin died in 1987, 3 days after her 66th birthday. Her obituary in the New York Times mentioned her pioneering role as one of the first female aviation engineers and the success of her manufacturing business. It made no mention of the Breslin loop or the thousands of pilots whose lives had been affected by her innovation. Her brother Michael, who survived the war and the peace that followed, knew better. At her funeral, he brought his old flight jacket, the leather cracked and faded, and laid it on her coffin alongside a photograph of a P-47 Thunderbolt. No words were needed. She would have understood.